Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to get logged in, and then we'll get started. Morning, everyone. As I mentioned, we are waiting about another minute or so for everyone to get logged into the session, and then we'll get started. All right, the totals seem to have slowed down, so we will get started now. So welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Silvernail. I am the Associate Director of Financial Aid here at the Harvard School of Public Health. I've been here for the last 3 years, but I've been at Harvard overall for about 22 years. And Salam, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Salam Kasu. I am the financial aid coordinator, and I've been at Harvard Chan for about a little bit over a year.
So thank you, Salam. Salam is going to go off camera for now while we do the presentation, but she'll come back on when we get to the Q&A. So the way this is going to work, and by the way, Sanate Mulu, who is on this slide, will be joining us, but she has a conflict earlier, so she'll be joining us later on in the presentation. But the way this will work is we're going to do a brief presentation, but there's also a Q&A panel option. If you look at your options on the Zoom link, you'll see a Q&A option. That's if you have any specific questions you want to ask, you're welcome to ask them there. Some of them we will just address offline if we don't think they are generally relevant to a larger audience, but at the end of the presentation, you'll also have a chance to ask questions, and Salam will bring up any questions she thinks will be of general interest to the audience. So with that, let's get going. So first thing to talk about is eligibility for grant and scholarship aid. So the first thing when we talk about grant and scholarships is grants, scholarships, and fellowships basically are terms we all use interchangeably. So when we say financial aid, we're really talking about grants and scholarships and fellowships. In order to be considered for merit or need-based funding, you have to complete the financial aid application. Most programs are eligible for financial aid and can apply for financial aid. So as you see on the left-hand column, under eligible programs, you have the MPH programs, the Masters in Science programs, the Doctor in Public Health, MPH in Epidemiology, and the MPH Generalist program. So most programs are eligible to be considered for financial aid and should complete the financial aid application. The one exception on that list is PhDs. PhDs do not have to complete the financial aid application, as they will automatically be considered for funding as part of the admissions process. There are a few programs that do not qualify to apply for financial aid through our office, and those include the Masters in Healthcare Management, the SM 42.5 Summer Only or Summer Focus program, and the MPH 45 Summer Only or Summer Focus program. But with those exceptions, all the other programs are eligible to complete the financial aid application to be considered for financial aid. So with that financial aid application, there are some important things to realize. So firstly, you have to apply for admissions before you will receive the link to apply for financial aid. So you have to submit that application, and then in early to mid-December, you're going to receive an email from our office with instructions on how to complete it. But as I said, that admissions application does have to be submitted first before you will receive that link. The application opens in the middle of December, and it's due by January 8th. And I'm going to emphasize that a couple of times during this presentation, because January 8th is the deadline. And yes, that means you are going to have to apply before you know whether you've been admitted or not. But you absolutely do need to submit that application by that January 8th deadline. If you don't submit by that January 8th deadline, then you will not be considered for merit or need-based financial aid. So it's extremely important that you apply by that January 8th deadline. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the cost of attendance. So the cost of attendance is the annual cost of attendance you'll see here. Now, as you see, this is the figures for the 2024-2025 year. It's not for the upcoming year. We won't know the specific tuition fees figures for 25-26 until sometime in typically around February. So this is an example of the current cost of attendances. You'll see from this chart, we've broken it up into two different categories. There are the direct charges that you're paying to the school, and then you have your estimated living expenses. So as you can see, each program does have significantly different costs depending upon which program you're applying to. It's also important to realize that this is the annual cost of attendance, which is not necessarily the entire cost for the program. So for the MPH 45 program, it is the full cost because the MPH 45 is a one-year program. But if you're in, for example, the MPH 65 program, that is a 3-semester program. So when you look at these costs for a 3-semester program, you basically want to increase that cost by 50% to represent that third and final semester of the program. Similarly, with the SM80 program, the Masters in Science 80 program, that is a 2-year program. So you need to double that cost to reflect how much the second year of the program would cost when you're estimating what the total cost of attendance is. Now, this annual cost of attendance is important for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's important because you will want to understand roughly what you can expect for your cost to be, but also it figures into how much you're going to need to certify for visa purposes. And so you'll see a link below, and you can find this on our website, where you can find more information upon the visa process, how to apply, and how much you need to certify in order to attend. The basic certification amounts are going to be equal to the annual cost of attendance for the year if you are a single individual who is not bringing dependents. If you are bringing dependents, then there's additional costs that you're going to incur for those dependents over and above this cost. But when you're looking at roughly what you're going to need to certify if you're a single individual without dependents, it's going to be roughly similar to this figure here. Now, as I said before, though, this is the 24-25 figure, not what the figures are going to be for 25-26. So we won't, this is only an example. You should expect that next year's cost of attendance is going to be somewhat higher than this individual figure. So we mentioned that in addition to the direct costs you're paying, there's also living expense costs. Now, living expenses are the element that you have the most control over, because depending upon how much you end up paying for rent, for food, for personal expenses, you have some control over what those costs are going to be. So these figures that you're seeing here reflect sort of estimates that we've come up with looking across the student population. So roughly based on our estimates, students are paying around $1,864 a month for housing, $548 for food, $442 for personal, $90 a month for transportation, which represents the subway pass. So it's roughly $2,950 a month is roughly what our estimates are for living expenses. So when you are looking to determine how much you're going to need in order to pay for your living expenses, and of course, that's also a function of your visa, that's the estimate that's used for those purposes. If you have lower expenses, you may be able to live on less than this. And so we certainly encourage you to look for opportunities to reduce these costs. So there are some opportunities to live on campus, and these figures include those estimates. There is what's called Shattuck House, which is a housing facility that's sort of an on-campus opportunity associated with the Harvard School of Public Health. There's Vanderbilt Hall, and then there is apartments through Harvard Housing. So you do have the opportunity to reduce costs by living, especially in Shattuck Hall, and Vanderbilt are one of the lower cost options you're going to find. So we certainly recommend you look into those opportunities to reduce your overall living expenses. All right, so we've mentioned the fact that you need to complete the financial aid application to be considered, but we do have to talk about some realities, which is we certainly encourage all students to apply for financial aid. And financial aid decisions are going to be made on a combination of merit, financial need, and the background of the students. But be aware that funding is limited. Sometimes students who apply to Harvard sort of are under the expectation or understanding that since Harvard has a large endowment, that there's a lot of funding available for all students. Unfortunately, the way it works is each school at Harvard has its own independent endowment. We don't have one shared endowment. So certain schools, like the undergraduate college, have a very large endowment and are able to offer very generous financial aid. The Harvard School of Public Health, on the other hand, has a much, much smaller endowment and unfortunately is not able to offer large amounts of funding. We certainly do offer some funding to students, and you can see in this chart that it ranges. I mean, it ranges between roughly typically 30 to 40% of students is roughly the average of what you can expect of students who receive some support from the school. But even for those who do receive some support, the amount that we're able to provide is generally not that high. The most typical awards that we're able to offer to students who do receive some funding is 25% to 50% of tuition. And that's the tuition figure, not the entire cost of attendance. There are a few opportunities that we will consider you for through the application for financial aid for funding that's higher than that. It's called the Presidential Scholarships Program. But as you see, there's only 10 students total are going to receive that type of funding. There is no separate application for that. You'll be automatically considered if you submit the application for financial aid. But it's only a small number of students who are able to receive more than the typical 25 to 50% of tuition awards. And so you need to think and plan accordingly. Now, what I just said was true of the master's programs. The Doctor of Public Health, DRPH, is a little different. If you're applying to the DRPH program, that is a very set standard funding mechanism. And the way that works is if you demonstrate financial need, then DRPH students receive a scholarship for 50% of the tuition costs for the first 2 years of the program. After the first 2 years, the tuition itself drops to 50% of the original total. And so that reduces the net cost to the same cost that you had in the first 2 years. So that one is a very set funding model. But for all others, it's going to range typically between about 30 to 40% of students receiving some funding. And of those who receive some funding, the typical award is between 25% to 50% of tuition. Now, in addition to funding through the Harvard School of Public Health, there are some other opportunities that are very student-specific through a central university office called the Committee on General Scholarships. And you will see a link here, scholarships.harvard.edu, that you can investigate. Now, these are very specific because it's funding for certain students from a very select number of different countries. So not all countries are going to be represented, unfortunately. But there are some funding opportunities that may be available depending upon what country you're citizen of. Bear in mind, however, in order to be considered for this, you have to be in a full-time program and a full-time residential program. So the MPH-EPI program, the summer focus programs, the part-time students, Masters in Healthcare Management, these will not qualify. So it has to be a full-time residential program to qualify for these programs. We also strongly encourage students to do everything they can to identify external scholarships. We do have an external scholarship database that's on our website. So we certainly encourage you to go to that website and to review the information that's there. Now, this website represents all of the different opportunities that we've identified over time, either through our individual research or because we've had students who have enrolled who have notified us they've received external scholarship opportunities. And so when we find out about those opportunities, we add them to this external scholarship database. So it's the best tool we have available to provide you information about these opportunities. We do not have the opportunity to go on an individual basis to say, here are the individual scholarships to which you should apply. We just don't have that ability, and every student is so different. So unfortunately, you do need to do your own research, but we think that the best initial step is to go to that external scholarship database, review it, and see if you can identify opportunities that might be relevant to you and your individual circumstances. In addition to scholarship aid, there are some opportunities for loan borrowing and for student employment. So when it comes to loan borrowing, you're talking about private loans. There are some opportunities to borrow private loans, some of which are going to be easier to get than others, some of which, however, have limits on how much you can borrow. So we have links here where you can find more information. The Harvard Federal Credit Union, for example, you are able to borrow up to $30,000 per year without a U.S. citizen cosigner. And so that's the opportunity that I would say the majority of students who are borrowing. But it is limited to a maximum of $30,000 per year. If you have a U.S. citizen as a cosigner, then you can borrow more than that, up to $50,000. But that's the hard limit on how much you can borrow under that program. There are some other lenders who you could potentially borrow through for amounts above that $30,000. For example, Empower and Prodigy are two where we see a relative number of students who end up borrowing through those programs. However, you do need to be very careful when you're borrowing beyond what the credit union allows you to borrow for a couple of reasons. First is, before you decide to borrow, you have to make absolutely sure that you can afford to repay the monthly amount on those loans. And that's going to be extremely important. You should never borrow more than you can realistically repay once you graduate. So that's the first step. Second thing you have to take into consideration is you have to disclose, if you're borrowing from more than one source, let's say you're borrowing $30,000 from the Harvard Credit Union, and then you go to a lender like Empower or Prodigy, and you want to borrow beyond that $30,000, you have to disclose to those lenders any other borrowing you're also doing, because when they are determining whether or not you're going to be eligible, they're taking into account the total indebtedness that you're going to have. We have had cases in the past where students were originally approved and then were later denied because they didn't disclose this. And then once the lender found out about the additional borrowing, they then revoked the loan. And that leads to my third piece of recommendations or cautions, is that you need to be extremely sure that these loans are going to be, that you're going to qualify. Because if you borrow through a lender and use that information to secure a visa, and then later on that loan gets canceled, either because the student cancels it on their own or because the lender determines that they're not able to lend to you, we then need to notify the Harvard International Office that you no longer have that funding, and you can have your visa revoked if you're not showing that you have sufficient funds to meet the requirements of the visa. So be very careful when considering about borrowing, but if you choose to borrow, there are options that are available. There's also opportunities for student employment. Students are able to work up to 20 hours per week on campus. Obviously, this is relevant if you are a residential student, and that is certainly an option that a lot of students take advantage of. Now, however, be aware, this isn't something you're going to be able to use for visa purposes. You secure the employment after you already arrive, and student employment earnings cannot be used as part of what you use to certify for your visa. So this can certainly help you pay and defray your living expenses when you arrive, but you're going to have to still be able to show that you have the full amount available in order to meet the financial requirements for the visa. So you aren't going to be able to take student employment into account. That's also true if you're looking to receive a research or teaching assistantship. There are opportunities available, and if you go to our website, and you will see it at the first link under Office of Financial Aid. If you go to that link, you'll find a link to find more information about teaching and course assistantships. But again, these cannot be used for purposes of your visa. And also be aware, just like other student employment, these positions provide a weekly paycheck, which can help with living expenses. They do not come with any kind of tuition waiver, tuition reduction. They're solely employment income that you'll be able to use for your living expenses, not to offset your tuition and fees. So bear that in mind. A lot of students still do work. It can definitely reduce some of your expenses, and it can be great professional development, but you're not going to be able to use it for visa purposes. We've mentioned the website on a number of times, and we certainly encourage you to spend some time looking at our website. Here's sort of a quick link or a shortened link to it. We encourage you to look at it. I will mention that we are currently going through a process of bringing online a new website. So some of the links may change, but there should be automatic sort of links in order to redirect links so that you can get to the website after the new website goes into place. But bear in mind, there may be some changes to the look and feel of the website over time. I want to reemphasize again that January 8th is going to be that deadline to apply for financial aid. Every year, we do have circumstances where we get contacted after January 8th or after students admitted saying, oh, I missed the deadline. I didn't think I was going to be admitted. I didn't submit the application. I'd like to be considered now. Unfortunately, it's going to be too late at that point. You have to meet that January 8th deadline in order to be considered you don't meet that deadline, regretfully, we're not going to be able to consider you for scholarship aid. So please put it on your calendar now. Make sure you check that deadline. When you get that link and you complete the application, you're going to have the opportunity to log into the application website. And once you submit it, you can go to the document section and you can confirm whether or not it's been submitted. So do make sure, in addition to submitting it, that you confirm that it was successfully received. And also, don't wait until the last minute to receive it. Even though the deadline is January 8th, you should get access to complete this application by the middle of December. And I strongly encourage you to complete it as soon as possible, because that way, if there are any problems, if you experience any difficulty submitting, if you're having internet issues, what have you, you have times to fix it. So try to complete it as soon as you possibly can once the application opens. However, if you do have any additional questions, hopefully we will be able to answer as many as possible during this webinar, but we certainly encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions after this session. The best way to reach us is probably through financial aid, and you'll see the email address there, financialaid@hsph.harvard.edu. Phone is not the best way to contact us. We work in a hybrid environment, and phones are not necessarily the fastest way to reach someone. So emailing is good. If you want to meet with an individual financial aid person here in the office, then you can schedule an individual meeting through our Calendly link. You can see it there. That being said, one sort of caveat to that, which is the one thing we can't do is there's no way for us to give you an individual idea of your likelihood of receiving financial aid. We frequently get people who reach out saying, what is the likelihood I personally am going to qualify? And unfortunately, we're just not able to determine ahead of time what your likelihood of receiving funding is. The only way you're going to be able to be considered for that and determine that is to complete the financial aid application to be part of the consideration process. And then lastly, of course, there's information on our website, and there is a link again. So with that, Salam is going to come back online, and we are going to address the various questions that have been coming up in the Q&A panel.
Yes, we just got a couple. And I also just wanted to preface by saying that some of the questions are tax related, so cannot be really answered by our office, but I will ask them as they were asked. So our first question is if student employment earnings will be taxed accordingly as well.
Yeah, I will answer that very generally, but there is what's called the Harvard NRA tax office. So if you go to the Harvard NRA tax office, you can just Google that. You'll find a lot more information. Also on the Harvard International Office website, they have information about taxation. When it comes to taxation, the answer is it depends. In general, for example, students are automatically going to be taxed. Yes, if your student employment is considered taxable income. So for example, if someone was a US citizen or permanent resident, they would be taxed just like any other student. And an international student is going to be taxed in the same way. There are some issues when it comes to individual countries who may qualify for tax treaties, and that's where you can find information on the NRA tax office. So there are some individual countries which have specific tax treaties which may adjust that. But as a general rule, yes, taxes will typically be withheld. You might potentially be able to qualify to get a refund for some of those taxes by filing a US federal tax return, where potentially if you overpaid in taxes, you can get a portion of it back. But generally, yes, any kind of student employment is considered taxable income.
And our next question it's a little similar. It's about student employment, but are there any opportunities for international students to work off campus, and what are the visa or work authorization requirements for doing so?
That you definitely need to reach out to the Harvard International Office, HIO. So if you Google HIO, Elizabeth Capuano is our contact there, and they have drop-in office hours on a weekly basis. And so if you go to their website, you can make an appointment with them and they can talk it through. There are some circumstances for some students who are who are here, who are affiliated with individual employers. There are some Harvard affiliated hospitals where potentially you may be able to work at a Harvard affiliated hospital, but that's not our area of expertise. The Harvard International Office is going to be the best equipped and qualified to talk about any individual questions in that regards.
Yeah, and our next question is very similar in that sense, and we'll have the same answer, but the next question, for everyone's sake, is can international students on visas work without work authorization such as H3 or O3 be eligible for student employment?
Yeah, again, this is definitely an HIM question. We are not the experts when it comes to employment and visa statuses. Bear in mind, there will be an individual session that if you are admitted in typically, I think in March, I can't remember the exact date, but there is a session that's hosted that is jointly hosted by the Financial Aid Office, the Admissions Office, and the Harvard International Office that will be held, which would be specifically talking about various types of visa issues. And that's going to be also a great opportunity to get questions answered specific to visas. But you can, in the interim, reach out directly to the Harvard International Office, and they should be able to assist.
Our next question is, does the university provide guidance on how international students can manage student debt or financial planning if they plan to stay and work in the country after graduation?
Well, in some ways, Salam is going to be best able to answer this question because she is one of the individuals who manages our financial health series. It's called Financial Health and Literacy Series. So Salam, if you want to address that.
Yeah, I mean, we will do our best, and I want to be careful because I don't want to say that we like give individualized advice, but we definitely do our best to give students different resources on how to best manage that. We also provide like loan exit counseling sessions. So you'll be counseled on what your loan repayment will look like or best strategies. So we definitely try to prepare you for that.
And we bring in presenters to do sessions on budgeting, on loan borrowing, on financial literacy. So there are different sessions we hold throughout the year to help students try to address some of these elements. However, if you have very sophisticated questions, then your best bet is, if you can afford it, is to get a personal financial counselor. If you Google out there, there are individual organizations who have individual financial counselors who may be able to give you specific advice. But we're happy to answer sort of general questions, and we hold individual sessions or group sessions for students, which may be relevant. But it really kind of depends upon just how unique your individual circumstances are, whether or not we're going to be able to provide direct assistance.
Our next question is about the financial aid application. Are there any documents that need to be supplied for the eligibility for the application? And do they need to prepare any like pay slips, etc., for proof?
We do not require proof ahead of time. So the financial aid application is very basic. There are sections which ask about your current income and asset information for both you and your spouse, about any kind of scholarship aid you're receiving from external sources. So it's a very, very straightforward financial aid application. There's also a section which allows you to explain any kind of special or extenuating circumstances that you think is unique to yourself, which is not readily reflected on the information that you're submitting on that financial aid application. So none of that requires you to submit actual documentation. Now, if we have any reason to believe that there may be something inconsistent with the information you've submitted, we can request additional documentation. This goes without saying, but our expectation is all students are expected to answer the questions honestly and fully. And if anyone were to receive funding and it were to be determined later that the information that was provided was not accurate, then any financial aid that we may have offered would be rescinded if that information turned out not to be accurate. But that being said, it's sort of a bit of an honor system. We don't require you to actually provide physical documentation of the information.
Our next question is a visa question. If an international candidate is already in the US and do not need to apply for an F1 visa anymore, do they still need to provide the financial evidence?
Again, you probably need to talk to the Harvard International Office because typically if you are currently on a visa, you have to transfer that visa from your current institution to the new institution. And you typically need to show documentation of that you have the funding available, because just because you are on a visa at one institution, it doesn't mean you still have the resources available at the new institution, which has new costs. But there is a process through the Harvard International Office if you have a current visa to transfer it from one institution to another. But yes, you would still need to show the financial resources to qualify for the visa.
Our next question is about the DRPH program. Can a DRPH applicant receive the presidential scholarship?
No, the presidential scholarship is strictly for the master's programs, unfortunately.
Does the university have any partnerships with international loan providers or offer recommendations for securing educational loans as an international student?
We don't specifically endorse any particular loan. We are neutral. We don't have any like partnerships where, well, with the exception of the Harvard Federal Credit Union, where we have a specific arrangement which allows students to borrow up to $30,000 without a U.S. citizen cosigner. That is the one specific special arrangement we have. We have a risk share agreement with them, which allows us to do that, where we bear some of the costs of any kind of defaults, and the credit union bears other portions of that. So that's the only specific arrangement we have. There are other lenders which will lend, as I mentioned earlier, like Empower and Prodigy. And on the website that we showed previously on the slides, you're going to find more information. If you go to our financial aid website and go to the loan section for international students, you will find a link that will take you to the different lenders who have indicated that they are prepared to lend to international students here. But we don't have any specific partnerships with any of them.
So this is also obviously a question, but to obtain an international visa, they need to have proof of funds. So in what form does this need to be? For example, I have funds maturing in a locked fixed rate savings account due to mature in the summer. Could this be used?
Again, the answer is going to be it depends. So for funds to qualify, the funds have to be in a bank account that is in US dollars in an institution that is either a US institution or has branches in the US in order to qualify for a visa. So if you have funds that are locked in, those could potentially qualify depending upon what type of bank it is. Like, is it in the US? Like, let's say you have a certificate of deposit. If those funds are locked but are going to be available before your enrollment starts, because that's going to be critical. If the lock is ending in May and you're starting in September, and it's a US bank, and it is in US dollars, then yes, that would likely qualify. I can't give you a definitive answer because that's a very hypothetical question, but potentially it could qualify. But if it was not a US bank or not in US dollars, or the lock period was ending after you actually needed those funds to pay for your program, then no, that would not qualify. Generally, for visa purposes, the funding that students provide is going to be a combination of bank statements in their own name, because it can't be an account that is in, say, a parent's name. This has to be an account that is in a student's name. It has to be in US dollars, and it has to be a bank that is either a US bank or at least has branches in the US.
And this is kind of a follow-up question to that. When in that timeline do you have to show proof of funds?
So it's going to vary a little bit by student, because you have to back it up from the purpose. When you get a visa, you have to make appointments with the embassy in your country, the US embassy in the country, in order to secure the actual visa. So you have to have your I-20, which is a document that you're going to get in order to get that visa, done in sufficient time to make an appointment with the individual embassy and to actually get the visa. And that can vary dramatically from a time perspective. So typically the deadline is going to be sometime around May 1st in order to have your financial certification and your visa, your I-20 request done by at the very latest. But different students may have to allow for even more time than that, depending upon just how long the waiting period might be for scheduling an appointment with your individual embassy. But I would say at the latest, typically, it would be around May 1st.
This is a question about aid and the difference between need-based and merit-based. Is there a difference in terms of the percentage of aid or grants given for need-based or merit-based scholarships?
Yeah, it's a good question. There isn't any funding which is strictly merit-based. All the funding determinations that are made are a combination of need and merit and the background of students. So when we make those assessments, the information you're submitting on your financial aid application is going to help us determine how financially needy you are in comparison to the other students who have been admitted to the program. And then the Office of Admissions and the individual departments will give us their assessments of the relative merit of the individual candidates. So it's a combination of those factors, but there isn't any money which is strictly merit. There isn't any money that is strictly need-based. It's all a combination of the different combination of those characteristics.
This is a question about employment. And if you ask the question and want to further clarify as well, that'd be great. But is there any possible work at any hospital as part of work on campus?
Kind of as I mentioned before, you really need to talk to the Harvard International office. I do believe that it is possible to work at some of the Harvard affiliated hospitals that are local while on a student visa, but this is getting outside of my area of expertise. So I still strongly encourage you to reach out to the Harvard International office. They're going to be able to give you a much more definitive assessment.
Our next question is about Harvard housing. As a Harvard public health student, do you get access to on-campus or off-campus Harvard apartments at special rates, or is it the same prices as regular apartments in the market?
There's not a precise answer to that, so I'm going to answer it slightly differently. I mentioned before Shattuck Hall and Shattuck House and Vanderbilt Hall. Pardon me, it's a little noisy outside. Hopefully you don't hear that sound. These are two sort of basically apartment buildings that are affiliated with the Longwood medical area. So the Shattuck House is specifically affiliated with the Harvard School of Public Health. Vanderbilt Hall is associated with the Harvard Medical School, but they do allow school of public health students to live there. The cost for these particular living is generally below the general Boston area market price. So living there is probably going to be some of your less expensive options. Harvard also has what's called the Harvard University Housing Office, and they offer a lot of different apartments that are available all across campus, some that are near to Longwood, some that are nearer to Harvard Square. And there's definitely opportunities there, but those tend to be market rate. They do not tend to be less expensive than what you would find in the general community. They can be a lot more convenient because if you're living in Harvard housing, you don't have to pay first month's, last month's security deposit. All the utilities are included as part of the rate. So it can be a lot more convenient, but it isn't necessarily going to be less expensive.
Our next question is for the online MPH Generalist program. Are the financial aid stats similar to the MPH FE online or the MPH Generalist stats?
It's closer to the MPH 45, MPH 65 program, meaning about typically around a third, somewhere between 30 and 40% of students typically are going to receive funding. The MPH FE program has a higher percentage, so that's not the best to compare it to. But the comparison to the MPH 45 and the MPH 65, roughly the same percentage of students in those programs receive funding.
This question is about the PhD and DRPH program. After a PhD or
Pardon me,
DRPH.
just a second.
No worries.
He said to close my door. We have a lot of noise going on there, so my apologies.
No worries.
So what was the
Yes. So after a PhD or DRPH, how long is the opportunity to start working? 2 or 3 years? Question mark.
Again, Harvard International Office. There is what's called OPT, which is optional optional practical training where you can extend your stay in the United States depending upon the individual degree and program that you are pursuing. But again, that is an area of expertise for the Harvard International Office, and they will be able to address the specifics about how long you can stay in the country and work after the end of your studies.
Oh, our next question is about the application process again, but in terms of a partner's income. This is a little bit more of a specific question, but this person will be getting married early next year. Do they include their partner's income? Because they will be their spouse by the time like they begin their program and will become a two-income household.
Yes, then you should, because we're looking at what your financial circumstances are going to be as a student. So if you are going to be married, then you should include your spouse's income and assets as well.
Our next question is, if an applicant is in the middle of the immigration process with the expected residence / visa approval mid-spring 2025, and they expect to start the program in summer of 2025, should they be completing the financial aid application as an international or domestic student?
Well, you're going to want to sort of, the good news is that domestic international students are equally eligible for funding. There's very little differences when it comes to what scholarship opportunities are available for domestic or international students. So you're certainly welcome if you complete the international application and then you become a domestic student later. That doesn't make any difference to your qualification for scholarship aid from us. So you can go right ahead and just complete the international application. A question we received yesterday, and I think it might be relevant here, is somebody asked if they are going to be applying for permanent residency, do they have to complete the visa process? And the answer is yes. If you are not yet a permanent resident of the United States, then the only way you can come here to secure a visa is to get a visa in order to study here. So if you're not yet a permanent resident, then you do need to complete that entire process. Now, of course, if let's say in February you were to become a permanent resident, then at that point you could just notify the Office of Admissions, show them that you are now a permanent resident, and then you would no longer have to complete the visa process in order to study. So it's a matter of timing in a way when that status is secured.
This is a question about the timeline of our financial aid application. So when do results get released? Is that together or after the admission decision has been released?
We release scholarship decisions at the same time as admissions decisions. So you should expect to hear both basically at the same time.
And I just wanted to add that applying for financial aid does not impact your admissions decision. I know we probably already said that, but again, like apply if you think that there's any chance and you want that opportunity, because there is not an opportunity to reapply for financial aid. So yeah.
No, that's a great observation. Thank you, Salam. Yes, just to reiterate that, yeah, there is no connection between the applying for financial aid and your likelihood of being admitted. That is absolutely not a factor in the admissions process. Sometimes, unfortunately, some students sometimes will be kind of upset by that, because sometimes what will happen is a student will be admitted and then they don't get any funding from us, and they're like, well, why did you admit me if you weren't going to provide me for enough funding to attend? And our answer is, unfortunately, the two processes are completely independent. If we did the reverse, which is we only admitted people who could demonstrate that they could fund their program, then you would have far more people who would be upset saying, why wasn't I considered for admission due to my financial circumstances? So those are completely separate from each other, but have no fear. Applying for financial aid will have no impact upon your likelihood of admission. And as Salam said, you absolutely need to meet the deadline, because there is no reapplication process later during the program. So if you don't receive funding initially, you're not going to receive funding for a subsequent period either, unfortunately.
And this is kind of about the application as well in terms of funding. Is there a chance to appeal for financial aid if the office rejects? And for example, we could provide proof for the need for the financial aid during the appeal.
Well, I mean, students always are, we would never prohibit students from once financial aid decisions from reaching out to us, but the decisions are final. When we make our decisions, we do what's called over awarding, meaning when we make our awards, we actually make more awards than the money that we have available. Sort of like on an airline where they will sometimes overbook seats because they know that some students are not going to attend. So when we are making our decisions, we know that a certain percentage of the students who we offer funding to are not going to be able to enroll. And so we actually over offer, knowing that. So basically to try to come in at roughly what our funding eligibility is. So when we're looking at requests for reconsideration, we can only look at those requests if there's funds available. And typically there are no funds available. Unfortunately, we literally have hundreds of students each year who are admitted who show 100% financial need that we are not able to offer funding to. So, as we said before, only around roughly a third of the students who we admit are we able to offer any funding to. And even that funding is typically only a 25 to 50% of the tuition cost for the program. So students can certainly submit any additional extenuating circumstances that they feel was not reflected in the information that was originally submitted to our office. So if there's something that you did not tell us about that was not clear on the application, you can certainly let us know. And if funding becomes available, we will certainly look at that information. But as a general rule, if you don't receive funding, there is no new opportunity for consideration because we will have spent all the money we have, regretfully.
And then this is kind of just to piggyback off that question, but if you do not get an adequate financial aid package, is there an option to defer admission to reapply for additional financial aid through internal and external scholarships?
So this is going to be a slightly nuanced question because the Office of Admission does allow students to request a deferral, but they do not allow a request for deferral based on financial circumstances. So you can, if you go to the Office of Admissions, say, I need a deferral because I don't have enough financial resources to attend, and I want to try to secure additional funding, that's not a basis under which they will grant a deferral. Typically, to grant a deferral, the reasons would be unexpected personal hardships unrelated to your financial circumstances, or employment, professional changes in your professional situation, which requires a deferment. If you are unable to secure funding, typically what you would need to do is you need to reapply for admission. They will not typically grant a deferment for that reason.
Our next question is about funding, specifically the presidential funding. What is the criteria that is considered when making that decision?
Yeah, it's the same criteria that's used for scholarship consideration in general. They're looking at, it's a combination of merit and need and your background. And so basically it's working with the individual departments, their assessment of the candidates that have been admitted to the program, our assessment of the financial need of the applicants. And we look at those, and each program has, typically like one presidential. The MPH, I think, has two that they can offer, two students that they can offer the funding to. So it's 10 presidential scholars across the entirety of the master's programs. So you are not able to separately apply for it. It's something you will automatically be considered by virtue of submitting that financial aid application.
And I think our next question is kind of a piggyback again off of that. And is there any suggestions to show merits or background in that process?
It's basically put your best foot forward when it comes to your application for admission, because they are going to be looking when the individual departments reach out to us to provide information for part of our assessment, they are basing it upon the information that you provided as part of your admissions process. So the stronger you are as an admissions candidate, the better situated you're going to be as part of the consideration for the presidential scholars.
And our next question, I was going to type out the answer, but it's our last question, it seems, or the last one we have so far. But around which month will the 2025, I believe they mean like financial aid and admission cycle start?
Well, I think the application for admission is already open, I believe. So you should be able to start applying for admission right now. And then in middle of December.
I think, or actually, no, they said this is for a 2026 intake. So I guess when does that application process start for next
Yeah,
year?
I think Sinead may remember better than I, and Sinead has just joined us, so hi, Sinead.
Yeah.
I think around typically September 1st is when the application for admission opens up. So next year, around the beginning of September, is when the application for admission for the following year would open. Our financial aid application will typically open in the middle of December.
Yeah, the admissions office typically will have their application available mid to late August.
Okay.
But is this for the 26-27 academic year?
Mhm.
Yes, they were asking about the
Yeah.
future year, right?
Okay.
The current application is already available for the upcoming
Yes.
academic year.
And that is all the questions that we currently have. So if anyone else, I mean, we still have a couple minutes, would like to ask any more questions, please feel free.
And I will say that this session is being recorded, and so the Office of Admissions is going to ultimately, it probably take them about a week, will post the recording on their website. Same website where you went to register for the event in the first place. So you will have access to this. We also have previous sessions are already up there from previous times we've held this session, along with, I believe, the Harvard International Office's session from last year for the visa session that I mentioned earlier on. I believe they have their recording posted from last year. So especially because we got a lot of questions about visas for people who want to get a jump on that, you may want to be able to look at that. Thank you very much, Nate. You can look at those individual recordings and you may be able to get some of the answers to some of those specific questions that you had. Though again, I know I sound like a broken record, but a lot of the very specific questions you had about student employment off campus, whether you're eligible, you know, OPT, et cetera, you really have to reach directly out to the Harvard International Office to get specific questions like that answered. All right, do we have any last questions out there?
I mean, there was one that I had answered, but it was just pretty much just saying thank you so much for your time, Michael.
No, thank you all for attending. You know, it's great to have so many participants in this program. It helps us because the more questions we can answer now, it's fewer questions we have to answer later. But sort of like what we said earlier, and you saw the slide before, if you do have future questions, other than what's my likelihood of receiving funding, because we just cannot answer that one. But if it's other types of questions you have, certainly reach out to us by email or by making an appointment with us through Calendly, and we are very happy to try to answer any additional questions that you might have.
And we just got a question that came in. It's about the Titleman scholarship. Is the Titleman aid / scholarship applied for through the general financial aid application, or is that a separate application?
Well, you applied through our financial aid application. It does ultimately require an additional essay to be submitted. So what happens is if you say yes, when it comes to the question about overcoming hardship and disadvantage, then a new link will show up on that MyFinaid portal, which will allow you to upload an essay where you can better describe and explain your individual circumstances. I do want to caution that the Titleman Scholarship, we get hundreds of applications for that, but it's a university-wide fellowship opportunity that's for a limited amount. It's $11,000. It's for a single student across all of Harvard. And in the last 10 years, we've only had one student receive it. So just bear in mind, it is limited. We're not trying to discourage you from completing it, but you should just be realistic when it comes to the likelihood that that funding is going to be, A, you would be the recipient, and B, the amount of the funding, because as I said, it's about $11,000 typically. So it's not like a full tuition fees opportunity.
And that kind of connects to our next question. And I know we've talked about this in the presidential scholarships, but do we have any full ride scholarships?
Really, the presidential is not even the presidential is not a full ride scholarship, because a full ride scholarship, it would, when you say that, it typically means full tuition and fees plus a stipend to cover all the living expenses. Though unfortunately, we just do not have those opportunities available. There are a few unique circumstances through the link that we provided earlier, scholarships.harvard.edu, for specific students from specific countries. You know, there's a a full tuition fees fellowship for students from Egypt, for example, that there's the opportunity to apply for. And there's a few other countries. There's the Kennedy Trust, Kennedy Memorial Trust opportunity. What are some of the other ones? Senate, let's see, there's the Kennedy, there's the, what's the other one that goes with the Kennedy? Sheldon Knox. So there are a few different opportunities available, but it's very country specific. And as a general rule for most students, typical funding is 25 to 50% of tuition, and only about a third of students receive that.
I know we're getting close to time, but we had another question. It's kind of visa related, but can I come with my dependent if I am on financial aid? And are there any daycare facilities at Harvard?
If you Google Harvard and sort of childcare, there are Harvard affiliated childcare centers. The costs are not particularly subsidized, so they are expensive. So bear that in mind. There are students, however, certainly who do come with dependents. So that is something you can do. You do have to show the financial resources, however, for those dependents. You're required to get medical insurance for them. And then, there's housing costs obviously associated with having dependents. So you will have to show a higher financial certification amount if you are bringing dependents. But yes, you can bring dependents if you have the financial resources. And there are some daycare facilities that are available. Thank you, Sinead. She put a link up where you can find some opportunities for childcare.
And we had another question. It's a little specific to the Fulbright program. And I'm just going to preface by saying that's not something that we oversee. But is Fulbright only for 2-year programs, or the 45 credit degree also counts?
No, there are students who are in the 45-degree program. Yeah, no, I've certainly seen Fulbright funded people that attend the MPH 45 program.
And I think that was our last question.
Okay, well, that's almost exactly the right timing too, because we're right on time. Well, thank you all very much for attending. And again, this session will be hosted. The recording will be hosted on the website. Please, if you didn't see the link that Snake put in the chat, where previous recordings are housed, that we strongly encourage you to take a look at those. You may find some information there. But thank you all very much for attending, and we look forward to hopefully having you as students here in our program.